And welcome to episode number 56 of Halfway There. This is the show where we believe the spiritual journey is never complete. You're always growing. That life with God is not something you attain, but something that you do. And I am glad that you decided to join us today. This episode is a interesting one, certainly, and I think you're going to enjoy it. Before I tell you all about my guest, let me tell you about how you can connect with the show. If you want to connect with me, if you want to connect with other people who are listening to the show, you can go out to halfwaytherepodcast.com. That takes you directly to the links for the archives of Halfway There. You'll see the show notes for this page and every page. You can click on a link to get to iTunes so that you can leave a rating or review. That really does help if you do those kinds of things. And there's also links to Facebook. If you want to go to the Facebook page, you can like the page there. You can follow on Instagram and or Twitter. If you want to just make sure that you never miss a show, or you want to share the show, if you enjoy any particular episode, including this one, it really does help a lot if you guys share the show. So thanks a lot for doing that. Okay. So today's episode is with a guest who I recently met and been connecting with online. Here's the thing. This is all about, she recently wrote a book about the purity culture and kind of answering some of the main propositions of that culture. Here's the thing. Here's my guess for many of you. If you're like me, you hadn't heard that term purity culture until I just said it. Because I'd never heard of it before either, at least referred to that way. And yet there is a way that in some Christian circles, purity, sexual purity, has been elevated higher than the gospel, and in fact, higher than God's grace. And my guest has some really great things to say about that. She definitely shares her story, and we talk a little bit about her interactions with what's called purity culture. I hope that you enjoy it. Probably not one you want to listen to with the kids in the car unless they're getting up there. It will, into ages where that's relevant, it will prompt some conversations that you might want to have or not. As a parent of teenagers, sometimes I understand that too, but they're important conversations to have with your kids, and so you gotta do that. Without any further ado, let me introduce you to Rebecca Lemke.
So I am a 21-year-old housewife and mom. I was homeschooled from first grade until I was about 15 and a half when I went to college. And throughout that time, I was raised in Christian purity culture. And purity culture kind of has two different facets. The first one, and it's a little bit complicated because the first one was initially kind of Christian, but it ended up having government funding. So I kind of see that one as more of a government secular thing because it was designed to bring down teen pregnancy rates. The second one, which is the one that I was raised in, is kind of a legalistic side of the purity movement. And the initial purity movement was mainly to encourage teens to wait until they're married to have sex. But the one that I was in took it a step further, and it said things like having a crush was an emotional STD, and having feelings for someone meant that you'd given your heart away, and kissing, hand holding, hugging, things like that were all the spiritual equivalent of having had sex, and that meant that you were damaged goods and things like that. So that's what I was raised with. And as I grew up, my husband and I, waited to have sex until we were married and all that sort of stuff. And we were very intentional about the level of physical affection that we kind of in the way we interacted with each other because of that. So we were very aware of that. And after we got married, I realized that there was a lot of negative effects to those teachings and that they were actually extra biblical and, kind of anti-gospel in a sense. So after that, I spoke with some friends and I kind of gave them some things that I had written about it. And they said, wow, this is really good. we think that you should go ahead and pursue this as a book or a project. And so I kind of went, okay, sure. And so the last year, from June to this June, so June of last year to this June, I spent writing a book
Wow.
about my experience.
Yeah. Well, I've read it, or about 90% of it. And so I was definitely impressed. There's some things that you say that I'm interested in hearing a lot more about. So you kind of gave us the brief overview, which is perfect. Tell us about sort of your house and your church kind of growing up. So do you have a moment when you came to Christ?
Well, it's a little bit complicated because I was born into the church. So
Uh
I
huh.
was born into a Lutheran Church Missouri Synod denomination and baptized, I think, when I was a month old. And then from there, when I was around, I want to say 11 or 12, I was put through confirmation, and that lasted until I was about 14. So I basically affirmed that, yes, I wanted to be baptized and all that sort of thing. But outside of that, I actually had a really hard time struggling with my faith when I was in confirmation. But before that, I can remember when I was about 4 or 5 and just being very, very interested in theology and Christianity and, everything about Jesus. I was all into that. And my mom noticed. She multiple times wanted to send me to a Bible college or something like that because she put me in Awana and things like that. And I always really excelled in that and really
Hmm.
enjoyed it. And that was actually part of how my husband and I bonded because we met at church and we talked a lot about theology. So that was a huge part of my life. Like I said, I think I remember that as early as like 4 or 5. And after that, once I was 14, I got confirmed and was accepted into the as a member of the church and took communion and all of that. And then got married in the same church shortly after, about 4 years later.
Yeah. Wow. You got married at 18.
Yes, I did.
Wow. Okay. So I can relate to that a little bit because we got married at 20. And
Nice.
now that I'm 40, I look back and I go, that was crazy. So
Yep.
you, I guess maybe you feel that way. I don't know. But that,
Yeah, we got pregnant about 3 months in,
uh huh.
so we we haven't had that much time to reflect on it.
Gosh. Yeah. Well, that's right. And you just kind of move on and you make it work. That's the way that works. But
Yep.
yeah, interesting. Okay. Well, that tells us something about you. So that's good. You kind of grew up in the church. You grew up. This was your life, and you um did you ever have a time when you kind of rejected Christianity at all? You mentioned that you kind of went through some hard times with that.
Yes, so I definitely did. About the time I was 11 or 12, I had been part of this homeschool group and a couple other groups, like a 4-H group and things like that, for several years, basically from first and second grade on. And by the time I was 11 or 12, there was a lot of problems. There was a lot of fighting within the groups and things like that. And all of the groups that I was in, except for a dance group that was a bunch of, kind of retired ladies, just fell apart. It completely fell apart, and there was some scandals and things like that. It was very rough. There was some sexual abuse stuff that had been blown up and kind of uncovered and things like that. And so it was very traumatic for several different reasons. But basically, we went home. And my mom was like, "All right, you're gonna have to find some new friends." And so I was told that I'd basically lost everybody that I'd known my entire life, all of these
Wow.
relationships that I'd poured everything into. And at that point in time, we were the normal homeschoolers for that point in time. So we didn't have cell phones, we didn't have email addresses. Some of us didn't even have TV. My family did, but so it was very isolating at that point in time. And the only time I left the house was to go to church and then my grandma's house after church, really. That was basically it, unless I was helping my aunt with her veterinary work. And so I was really kind of isolated just in general, and everything that had gone along with the splits had just made it worse. And I also contracted a virus that basically put me on the couch for about 3 months. And no matter what medication they gave me and stuff, it never really went away. I developed some pretty bad joint pain and things like that at that point in time. And I actually heard from a counselor later on that he thought the combination of the virus and the stress caused an autoimmune disease to flare up. So it was a very difficult time for me. And A few months in, I remember kind of just questioning a lot. I remember asking my mom a bunch of questions about the Bible that she couldn't really explain to me. In one of the church
Mm.
groups I had been in, not my church, but a different church, they had basically taught us to memorize verses out of context. So I had all of these verses that I didn't really understand, and a lot of them were from Revelation, which outside, like Revelation is scary as it is. Outside of the context of what it's talking about, it's even scarier.
Yeah.
So I was scared about that, and I didn't really know, do we still follow the Ten Commandments and all this different stuff? And my mom didn't really have answers for me. And this went on for a long time, and I ended up getting suicidal just because I felt like something was wrong. I felt like something was wrong with my friends, and I couldn't put my finger on it. And I eventually saw them in February, I believe, and I could just tell something was wrong. I could see it in their eyes. I could see that something was very, very, very wrong with all of us. And at that point in time, some of my friends had already tried to commit suicide. I tried shortly after that, and the night that I tried to commit suicide, I apostatized. So I left the faith that night, and I was obviously unsuccessful with a suicide attempt. But I just got to a very, very dark place, just out of despair and empathy for my friends.
Wow. So wait, tell me what that means. You left the faith.
So I basically, in my mind, I was like, okay, I can't deal with the fact that there is supposedly a God that loves me, quote unquote, and loves my friends, but would allow us to, be yanked around by a lot of abusive situations and things like that. And, have
Hmm.
these guys in the church, be pedophiles and come after us. And it was just it was to the point too that, we weren't allowed to see each other at this point because the moms weren't getting along, some of them. And it was just very hard for me, and I could tell that something was wrong with them, and I didn't put my finger on it. I just knew somehow. And so I kind of thought, okay, why is this suffering being allowed? We're kids. We're literally 11, 12-year olds. This doesn't make any
Wow.
sense for a loving God. And so at that point in time, I was like, okay, well, I guess that's exactly right. There is no loving God. And if there's no loving God, then I'm not serving anyone. And so I decided, I was like, okay, I'm not Christian anymore. I wasn't very public about it. I didn't tell my parents or anything like that, but I labored under that for several months until I ended up talking to my pastor. And even then it wasn't completely resolved, but it did get better after that.
Yeah. Wow. Those are deep thoughts for an 11-year-old.
Yeah. I look back and kind of go, wow, that was really dark.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Well, but the isolation perhaps, leads to
Yeah.
that.
Isolation is really intense. It's
Yeah.
it's a driving force for a lot of mental instability and spiritual pain.
That's well said. Wow. Interesting. Okay. Well, you obviously came back to the faith.
Yeah. I actually it's funny because somebody asked me about this the other day, but they asked me, why did you and all that stuff? And one of the things that I say is, I saw all of the darkness around me, and I kind of went, okay. Eventually, I was just like, this doesn't make any sense for there to be this much darkness and there not be an opposite to that. So
Oh
just
yeah.
because there's darkness around me right now doesn't mean there's not light.
Yeah.
Like all of this stuff is trying to push me away from something. And I think it's very, very intentional in that. And that's when I realized, okay, something's going on, something's trying to drive me away, and I'm not going to have it. And after I talked to my pastor, too, one of the things that he said that really, really changed things for me was I was asking all these questions, and he told me, I don't know. I struggle with this too. And that was completely groundbreaking for me because I never
Mm.
had a minister or any authority in the church actually tell me they didn't know about something. There was always answers to everything.
That's interesting because your experience of spiritual people, and I'm using scare quotes, um,
Yeah.
was that they had it all together, that they understood everything, and that they didn't have questions.
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah,
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah, that was my experience up until that point. And I absolutely love the pastor that I grew up with. He's amazing.
Mm.
I've never had any problems with my actual church, and he's the reason for it.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, well that's good. So okay, well that those are interesting because I mean, I'm thinking about this. I have kids that age, right? So
Yeah.
I think about, wow, that what, if my kids were going through that, what that would be like for them. And we've been through some tough stuff in our youth group recently in the last
Yeah.
year. So I can relate to some of that pain and watching them go through that. Your parents must have been were they aware of it at all, or was it?
Uh, I don't think they were aware of it. I'm still not sure that my parents are aware of that suicide attempt. I
Wow.
know my grandparents were, but I wasn't very communicative with my parents at that point in time. So my mom knew about kind of struggling with the faith, but she did not know, I don't think, about anything else. And
Gotcha.
my dad knew about the more suicidal stuff, but I don't think he knew as much as about me struggling with the faith. So it was kind of mixed.
Yeah. When did you first get exposed to the idea of the purity culture?
So I remember it as early as being about 7. I got my first crush on the boy I mentioned in the book at that point in time, and I didn't necessarily feel bad about it at that point, but it was shortly after where I started noticing that, crushes weren't acceptable in this environment and things like that. And then when I was around 10, that was really when it kicked up. There was like a love note that was passed around one of the groups I was in, and it went nuts after that. They started segregating the boys and the girls. We weren't allowed to talk to each other alone in any capacity, even if we were in like a room, a big room with people in it. And you had to stay a certain distance from each other when you were walking, and there was just all of these rules, and the modesty stuff got stricter. There was moms walking around, the boys moms, and they would like adjust your bra straps and things like that. They had no qualms about just coming up to you and like moving your
Oh,
clothing.
which
And
is weird anyway.
do what?
That's weird.
Yes, it is. I have personal space issues, so it always really upset me. And to this day, my sister-in-law once, when my husband and I had like just gotten married or just gotten engaged or something, she fixed my bra strap, and it was all I could do to not go ballistic. I was like, "No, you can't do that to me. No, no."
Wow.
She was like, "I'm sorry. I thought I was gonna embarrass you," and I was like, "Oh, it's okay. Just warn me first,
Right.
because
Wow.
I've done that way too many times by this point." So yeah, there was a bunch of rules, and from what I understand, a lot of them came from like Bill Gothard, and people
Yeah.
like that. But we never had any of that material. Like my parents never did, and I don't remember it in the homeschool group. And I actually didn't even read "I Kissed Dating Goodbye" by Joshua Harris until I was writing my own book. It's just somehow their ideas got funneled in without anybody knowing.
Yeah.
And it was very, very weird because then we didn't have a face or a name to put to the ideas. It was just, this is how it is now.
Yeah. Interesting. And that started. When did you say? Start 10
I
years
was
old?
about 10, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, a love note got passed around, and then the parents were like, "Oh no, they're hormonal."
Uh huh. At 10, which is really innocent. But anyway,
Yeah.
all right.
Oh
So
yeah,
so
very.
yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so take us to some of the things that maybe you were taught as a result of this sort of segregation about about love, about relationships.
Yeah, so I was kind of taught that relationships were more about obligation than they were about love. And that's something I still struggle with. So basically, I was taught that love was more of an obligation, and there was actually talk of arranged marriages at this point in time.
Wow.
There was a couple of the kids that were actually supposed to have arranged marriages. I was really taught that affection was not okay, that affection was sexual in every capacity, and that attraction was lust. So there was a lot of lines that weren't blurred, they were just really, really misconstrued. So that kind of ended up causing some problems later on because then it was, well, affection is bad and there's no switch that makes it good. So how do you deal with actually getting married and being expected to be affectionate and things like that? So that was really, really difficult. And it was just, I don't know. They had really weird things about relationships too. They didn't want people dating, they wanted people courting. But courting was very ill-defined, and so was dating. And courting was supposed to be a biblical method, but there was really no story they could point to in the Bible that outlined it at all.
Right.
And
Doesn't
just
actually
things like
occur in
that.
there. It It doesn't actually occur. Courting doesn't actually occur in the Bible.
Not that I've seen.
No, it doesn't.
Not in their definition of it.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So I want to talk about that. Um, because I think it's one of the points that I really loved about what you say in the book
Yeah.
is the way that scripture is used in this particular culture. So because it's so like we're talking about this, the idea of courting isn't really scriptural. That must come. I don't even know where that comes from. Is that from like medieval? I don't even know where that comes from.
Yeah, I think
Victorian
it's
era.
from kind of a puritanical England
Yeah.
thing. I've read a little bit about it, but not enough to know for sure. I don't know honestly where Joshua Harris got it. I honestly think he probably I think there was somebody older that he heard that type of thing from, and just kind of repeated it. You know how kids are, where
Yeah.
they hear something and then repeat it. So I think it was an idealized thing, an idealized way of doing relationships that had been repeated to the children within that generation and some of the older folks as well. And so when he wrote his book and when a few other people wrote their books, that's kind of what they pushed forward since that was what they'd heard as the ideal from their parents. Because my mom even was really interested in that in a sense. She thought that, you shouldn't date until you're interested in marrying the person. And I don't think she quite meant it the way she said it. But that was the impression I got. So
Yeah.
it's definitely something that I think that our parents just kind of came out of the sexual revolution or the wake of the sexual revolution. So they were looking for an idealized way to make things work correctly and perfectly.
Right. And that's where I think it's actually valuable. We need to have an idea of how are we going to handle building relationships and in ways that one, people don't get hurt. We don't do things that we don't that we're going to regret.
Yeah.
But at the same time, how do we value human beings and value, like you say, affection and sexuality in a way that actually is good?
Yeah.
Um, and so maybe that sounds like that didn't really happen, at least in your community and in others.
No.
Yeah. This is so. I wanted to tell you this, by the way. The
Yeah.
here's where I am kind of with this. I can see ways as I was reading your book that um that my wife and I were affected by the purity culture
Yeah.
in a ways, but I'm like 20 years older than you. So we got married in 1997. So I was aware of I Kissed Dating Goodbye, never read it, didn't matter to me at that point.
Yeah.
Um the but we the true love waits thing, we were definitely, given those and that whole thing.
Yeah.
So and my wife comes out of a much more fundamentalist church than we were.
Yeah.
And I'm a boundary pusher, so I went the other direction. But that then had effects on kind of our relationship.
Yeah.
But anyway, so when I hear about this, I'm always kind of filtering it through those kind of maps,
Yeah.
or those grids. But anyway, that's I wanted to talk about that because I didn't really because it does go back a ways, and you talk about
Yeah.
the sort of reaction to the sexual revolution, which makes sense. And kind of maybe an overreaction, so the pendulum swung too far, and I can see where so even 20 years before your time, we were dealing with that at the same time in ways that did negatively affect relationships.
Yeah, and it's been really interesting to me because you're not the only one who's pointed that out.
Yeah.
There's actually been a lot of people within the 20 years and 20 years older than me range that have said, like, even who are married, who are in different countries like the UK, who
Hmm.
have been like, yeah, I absolutely didn't realize this was a thing and it's totally affected me. I can't believe it. And it's been really interesting because I studied sociology in
Hmm.
college. And so I'm really into social norms and things like that anyways, but to actually see it play out in something that, played out in my life is really intriguing to me and sad too in a way, but it makes me hopeful because there is, a way to correct it, and there is any type of social norm, there's other things that you can do to kind of correct for it. So that
Yeah.
makes me hopeful, especially with Joshua Harris's new documentary, that we might be on the right course to correcting it. Obviously, it'll never be perfect, but
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. What is he doing?
so it's a documentary called I Survived I Kissed Dating Goodbye. And I don't have a lot of information on it yet. I know they'll be releasing more soon. Right now, they have a Facebook page and a Twitter, and they have introduced some of the people working on it, and just kind of their about me's and things like that. I'm really excited about it. From what I understand, it's going to be a Christian documentary, and I hope that it's really helpful. I'm very proud of Joshua Harris for doing that, because it's really hard to kind of reevaluate what you said publicly, especially when
Right.
you said it as a 21-year-old, which has been a worry of mine since I'm 21 and just wrote a book.
I was
Um,
I was curious about that actually. I was going to ask you,
yes.
are you so when you were writing this, did you have that sort of same sense in mind that okay, I got to be careful what I say and how I say it and
Oh,
what I
yes,
recommend?
yes. It
Yeah.
almost did not get written because I was like, there's no possible way I can account for every contingency in this.
Right. Right, which is part of the problem, right?
Yes, and I think that was part of the problem with his book too. Is when I actually read through it, I was honestly really surprised how much is not actually in there that I was told was in there.
Yeah.
So I'm actually really glad that I did read it. And the thing is too, that a lot of the purity movement does have some positives. So my husband and I used some types of behavioral modification, I would say, when we were dating, where we weren't alone together. Really, if we were alone, then we had the blinds up and everything when we were like at an apartment or something eating lunch, and we were just very careful about making sure that nobody could accuse us of anything. And there's things like that in the book where it's just kind of practical advice, and I think that that was definitely needed at the time. As I've researched more, I've noticed a lot of people were very, very helped by some of what Harris said. So I'm really
Mhm.
interested to see how the documentary goes, but it's just so interesting to me to see how everybody took it. And one thing that I've been particularly surprised about is a lot of people that had some type of sex education fared better than people who didn't in terms of how they processed it.
Wow. Yeah, that is interesting. Very interesting. Because I think you say in your book that you didn't have any of that.
Not really. My
Yeah.
parents gave me a book, but it was woefully insufficient.
Right, right.
And I don't think they realized that at the time, because after post-marriage, you forget the things that were very, very novel to you when
Right.
you were first starting out. So I don't blame them at all.
Yeah,
But
okay.
it
So
was
I'm going to at
interesting.
the risk of making an allegory, you know, it's that's one of the reasons I do this show as to ask about the experience people's experience with God. And we're going to draw back into your experience here in a minute, but um because I think it's so valuable to actually hear from other people who've been down the road. Um, we've had over 1,500 years of experience walking with the Lord on this show so far.
That's awesome.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? So, but it's valuable to hear some people, in their 70s and they're, or older, that the kinds of things that they've been through and that they still struggle and they still learn for the rest of us, to go, oh, okay,
Yeah.
that's helpful. And that might be true, in other areas of life as well, including sexuality. There's things that you just don't know because you haven't experienced it.
Oh, yeah.
And if you're getting bad information on top of that, then it's very, very difficult. So what I want to go back to the use of the Bible for a second. And then
Yeah.
I have a couple questions about kind of your experience, because you came to what I think is a really healthy view. And I'm curious how that happened. Um, so the the use of the Bible, you talk a little bit about scripture and how, a lot of passages were proof text or used out of context.
Mhm.
Tell us about, some of those, and then, how we can kind of avoid those kinds of things going in the other direction.
Yeah. So I still find things every day that I realize are proof texted and have to go back
Yeah.
and look. But initially, kind of how I learned about proof texting, which set the stage for me evaluating a lot of this, was my husband and I started talking. He had come to my church to learn Hebrew from my pastor for a different relationship that he was in. And he and I talked a little bit. I kind of told him how the relationships were structured within some of my communities. Basically, how it worked was the girls listened to the oldest man in the room, even if the oldest man in the room was a teenage boy who wanted you to do something sexual. And
That
so
doesn't sound right.
he kind of freaked out. He was like, that's not no. And it was a verse, I don't know where from, maybe Ephesians or Genesis. I honestly don't remember anymore. But it had been taken out of context. It had been translated literally, and they used a verse from that to say that, any woman had to listen to any man. and and it was very, very interesting. And so my husband took me back to the original language and was like, that's not what's happening here. No. And that was the beginning. That was the beginning of the unraveling. And I remember sitting there. It was like Christmas Eve, and we were sitting in the snow in the awning of the church, and the whole world was just turned upside down at that point in time. And it actually wasn't very scary for me. It probably should have been scary, but it really wasn't. I was more intrigued of, okay, this makes a lot more sense. I wonder what else would make a lot more sense if I knew more about it. And so from there, I learned about like Jeremiah 29:11, which is often used for prosperity preaching and things like that. And then one of the famous ones is also from Jeremiah that was from my childhood was the heart is deceitful above all things and
Hmm.
beyond cure. And it stopped there. That's how they used it. And there was no who can understand it and I the Lord or anything like that. It was just that. And so you have kind of this law, and they used it in the context of crushes. So they were like, well, your heart is deceitful, so you can't trust a crush, or you can't trust wanting something, whether that's a career goal or food or whatever. You can't trust that feeling. And so that was very, very difficult for me for the longest time. I remember growing up and constantly feeling bad that I wanted things.
Hmm.
And then later on, I actually looked into it, and as we were writing the book, my husband and I got so sarcastic. We had to we had to rewrite that section several times because he was just like, "This was a nation that had turned away from God. This was like a
Yeah.
huge deal. This was not two teens blushing at each other," and that was very cathartic for us.
Yeah. Interesting. Wow. Yeah. That's just the whole one, the one with the heart. The heart is deceitful. That
Yeah,
that one, just it drives me crazy because it's clearly pre Holy Spirit, and so if we believe that the Holy Spirit, well, not pre, I got you know what I mean by that, but
yeah, yeah.
um,
It's okay.
yeah, but if we believe we have the Holy Spirit living in us and that we've been regenerated, then our heart actually is following God, right? God
Yeah.
puts things in
Well,
our
and the
heart.
Psalms have created me a clean heart, oh God. Like,
Yeah.
ah.
It's a complete misunderstanding. Okay, I'm not gonna. There may be Calvinists listening, so, but that's all right. But sometimes they'll do the same thing with the heart, and they'll pass around this article about don't trust your heart.
Yeah.
I always get mad and give it a little angry emoji on Facebook.
I don't know that I've ever actually used the angry emoji, but one of these days I will get mad enough to.
That'll be a good one to use it for if you see it. But it's just like you can't. That's not only is it wrong, it doesn't take the human being seriously.
Yeah.
And that's what actually bothers me the most. Is what bothers me about parts of this community that you were in, and this kind of way of thinking about relationships and sexuality is because these things are good things, and you make that point. They're good things that God has given us, and so yes, they need to be within these guardrails, but they're still to be valued
Yeah.
and
Yeah,
not
absolutely.
restricted. I read today the part where you talked and compared it to the Pharisees, and I thought that was really strong.
Thank
um,
you.
because it's true and it's easy to do, to take what God has said and then put some parameters around it to kind of keep you from getting there, and that's exactly what the Pharisees did. And Jesus was the harshest of anyone with on them. So
Yeah.
that's problematic. Okay, so your husband shared with you a little bit of biblical exegesis that was good,
Yes.
and that started to open your eyes. Tell me about kind of how that kept going, because you make some really uh, good and sound gospel points in your book, and I'm curious how you got from the sort of legalistic purity culture to there, because you don't actually share that, at least in the parts that I read so far.
Yeah, so a lot of it has had to kind of do with the fact that I did have a really good pastor growing up from I don't even remember when he finally got the call to our parish, but for the majority of the time that I was growing up, I had a really, really, really great pastor, and he actually taught me Latin. And I hated the class at the time, and I was very frustrated because there was just so many things. He realized that something was wrong. He very much took care of me. He is like a second dad to
Mm,
me. He is an amazing and wonderful person. When I was having a lot of problems, he took me in, and I actually babysat for him and his wife, and that was just so good for me. But when I was younger, my sister and I took Latin from him because he was worried about us because he could kind of tell something was wrong, and he just wanted us to have a different environment. So my mom was teaching preschool down the hall, and he would teach us Latin. Well, he could tell by the time it was all said and done that I had a problem with boys. That was more than the ew, boys are gross, yuck type of thing. And so he actually talked to me a little bit over the years, and even in marriage counseling and things like that, we did premarital counseling with him. That just sex is good and all this stuff. I remember there was one time, and he kind of ticked some people off with this, but he likes all sorts of music, and there was a rock band thing that he had where he was singing, and it was a song about sex, and I was so mortified at the time, but it was a positive song about sex, and so I was just like, man, that's really weird. I cannot believe my pastor is goofing off in his free time singing this song with the youth. And I mean, we were old enough that it was fine, but and then during Latin class he would have us read some like stories about romance and things like that just to watch us squirm sometimes. And so he really kind of introduced the whole sex is good thing to me. So even though I grew up in the legalism and stuff, with that specific subject, I had a foundation that was retroactive with him. So
mm,
he set some different things in place to where later on they were strong enough. It was a strong enough connection that it eventually got to me where I was
yeah,
like, okay, I've heard this all my life, but there's this one person that I really, really, really respect, that I know he values intellectual honesty. He values scripture being used in context. He values the proper balance of law and gospel. And so when it came to that subject, and when it came to all of the law and gospel stuff he taught me, eventually I just uncovered all of the things that were lies, and everything that he told me was true. And so that was the base. It took a while to get to, but I already had that baseline. It just been covered and kind of tied down by lies and everything.
yeah.
So
So
once those came off,
I'm wondering where those were coming from then. So if this guy was the pastor of your church,
yeah.
was your church legalistic, or was your
No, not at all. My
okay?
church was
Your church
amazing
was
growing up,
great.
which is part of the reason why everybody was so confused when ended up coming out about the fact that I had problems and things like that, because they were like, "What do you mean? Your parents didn't teach this to you. Your church didn't teach this to you." It was my peer groups. It was some homeschool groups that I was a part of, and some other churches where I went to their programs, and my friends were just entrenched in it. They all had learned that, so I got it from other sources. and
Yeah.
and since my church is Lutheran, they we joke that it's, grandpa's church. They're very much into tradition. My whole family, going back generations, you can actually follow the immigration from Germany from some of my ancestors that were Lutheran. So my church is very, very historical, and it's not a fun church. It's not we have rock bands or anything like that. So at the time it was, oh wow, these other churches seem cooler. These other churches are focusing on topics that are quote unquote relevant. And so
Hmm.
I just kind of got drawn away through that, even though, I still attended my church regularly. It was just these other people seemed more authoritative. They were willing to take stands on things that my pastor wasn't. Well, my pastor wasn't, because he believes where scripture is silent, we stay silent. So you're not dogmatic about issues that aren't talked about in scripture.
Yeah.
So it was them being more authoritative than him too that really drew me to that,
Hmm.
at least in those areas.
Right. Right. Very interesting. Yeah, I'm just trying to take that in because so you write this, and I'm gonna read it if it's all right.
Okay.
But because I read it, and this is part of what I resonated with.
Yeah.
He said, "I'm writing this book because of a fundamental belief that I hold every person is made in the image of God, even if they don't believe in Him," which I think is very important. That was very good of you to say.
Thank you.
And as such, deserves to know exactly who He really is. Legalism paints us an incorrect picture of God, and this picture is not of a loving, merciful God, but a God that demands beyond human capacity to deliver and is unrelenting in these demands, which is absolutely right. This
Mhm.
puts us in the position of trying to please an impossible deity, recognizing our failure day in and day out, and omits Christ's death and sacrifice so we could be free. So maybe that's coming from your Lutheran roots. I didn't know that before, but that is absolutely right. When I read that, I bookmarked the page because it was so. I was like, that's precisely it. That's the problem with legalism, whether it's purity culture or anything else. It's
Yeah.
in whatever subject you want to talk about. That's the problem. It gives us an incorrect view of God, and so it sounds like you were kind of getting one view of God at church and a different view of God from your friends,
Yeah.
and you had to kind of reconcile that. And your pastor helped you do that.
Yeah, it took years, and I don't really know why it took so long, because while I was introspective as a kid, I think I needed space to
Hmm.
figure that out, because at one point I was very angry about the fact that I was left alone for so many months as a child, where I didn't have any friends or anything like that, and everything had blown up all at once. And now I'm actually very, very grateful about it. I ended up writing a post after talking to my husband at one point, because he was like, I honestly think that's what saved you. I think that time being alone and being angry at God, and actually talking to him, even though you were angry and didn't think you believed in him, I think that was what gave you the space that you needed, because you didn't have any more people telling you anything. You were able to work it out, just you and him, and that sort of thing. And it that's something that my husband pointed out that was really surprising to me when he pointed it out.
Yeah, isn't it interesting to look back and see those things that happened as gift, as grace, even though you were upset about it at the time?
Oh yeah, that's happened so much. In fact, one of the ways one of the funny stories I have about that is I hated my husband at first. Absolutely hated him. My pastor introduced me to him as this homeschool boy. He's graduated from college already, but he's this nice homeschool boy. And I went, no, I'm done with homeschooling boys. No. And so I refused to meet him for months. I hated his guts.
Wow,
And now I'm married to him. So
that's awesome.
my pastor was a matchmaker. When he met Thomas, he was like, "Hey, so when you go to seminary," they hadn't talked about going to seminary at all. We still tossed the idea around, but my husband's really into theology too. He was like, "When you go to seminary, make sure and swing back and pick Rebecca up, and then you can go to your parish." And he didn't. My husband hadn't even met me yet, and he fell out of his chair. He was like, "What?" And he's like, "Yeah, there's this girl. You're gonna get married."
Wow. So is he a little older than you?
Thomas, yeah, he's let's see, he's 8 years older than me.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, that makes more sense then.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, very good. Well, all right. So those are the things I was interested in. Is there anything you want to share with us beyond that?
Hmm. Let me think. Hmm. I don't know. I'm really still working through things even more after writing the book. It's really interesting. I thought I was done. I'm not done.
Yeah. Yeah, I bet there's a lot there, and you know what, you're young, and so you're gonna
Yes.
grow, and you've got a lot ahead of you. I will encourage you to do this. Keep writing because
Yes. Yeah.
you're gifted at it, and I enjoyed reading the book, and I enjoyed you just tackling a topic that kind of like I said earlier, I didn't realize had affected me as much as it had, but it was certainly not to the same degree as you, but it was very good to read, and you put things succinctly and well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. We didn't know what we were doing at all with the book. We're talking about doing a second one, and it's more going to be on like how to get through sex and relationships. I shouldn't say how to get through, how to manage them, because a lot of the people that I grew up with, and a lot of people that I know coming out of purity culture, really have a hard time because they don't know how to interact with the opposite sex. And I read a quote once in a library book, and I'm not going to get the quote right, and I don't even remember who said it, but it was basically that if men and women are to have respectful relationships, the foundation for that has to be laid in youth. Well, in
Mm.
the absence of that, I think that there needs to be something for people like me and other people who maybe their parents had strained relationships, or maybe they only had one parent and things like that, where they don't know how to respectfully interact and they don't know how the opposite sex works. And I think that that's probably going to be the next project.
Oh, awesome. All right. Well, that's good. I'll be looking forward to that. All right. Well, hey, thanks for coming on Halfway There.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Wow, thanks, Rebecca, for sharing your story. Guys, you can get the Scarlet Virgins, When Sex Replaces Salvation, at Amazon, or again, go to halfwaytherepodcast.com. You can find links to this show notes on this episode, and I've linked it up there so it's easy to find for you. I hope you will get her book. Rebecca, keep writing. I definitely want to encourage you to do that again. Friends, if you would, share the show. Go out to Facebook, go to Twitter, go to Instagram, and share the show. I would appreciate that. It helps get the word out. Tell a friend. Let somebody know who would be interested in listening. In fact, I know that you guys are doing it because every week we have more and more downloads. People are listening. So thanks a lot for doing that. It means the world to me. All right, well, next week we have another episode. Until then, friends, you know what to do. Keep the faith.